You're doing organizational development work. You just might not realize it. But now it's time to name it. Let's talk about it here on the Strategic Advance podcast. Welcome to the Strategic Advance, a podcast about building better organizations and supporting the people who put in the hard work to make that happen. I'm your host, Adam Poser. Last week, we launched with an episode 0, where I shared why I started this podcast, what I hope to accomplish, and what you can expect every week when you tune in. As a reminder, most episodes will run around 20 to 25 minutes, long enough for a commute or a walk, but short enough to keep things tight and respectful of your time. We'll occasionally go longer for interviews with experts and practitioners in the field, though. Chances are you're here because 1, you already work in this space, or 2, you're trying to make your workplace better, more effective, more humane, and more impactful. And either way, you're in the right place. Because today, we're laying the groundwork. We're answering 2 simple but powerful questions. What is organizational development, and why does it matter? Now, I know that sounds like the start of a high-priced college textbook, but this episode acts as a foundation for everything else we'll explore in this episode and more broadly, this podcast. If we want to have honest conversations here and in our workplaces about making organizations better, whether that's government, nonprofits, big corporations, or small, scrappy startups, we need to have a shared language and a shared framework to make those conversations productive. But before we get too deep, let's anchor ourselves with a simple question and a definition. What is an organization? There are a lot of definitions for organization, but the one that I'm particularly fond of comes from the Cambridge Dictionary, which defines it as a group of people who work together in an organized way for a shared purpose. Now, apply that definition to your day so far. Think about how many organizations you've interacted with just today alone. If you're like me, you've started your day either by making coffee or going to a coffee shop. You're interacting with numerous organizations involved in that process. If you've taken public transit or driven a car on a road, that involves numerous organizations in the public sector or even the private sector if it's a tollway. And even the shoes on your feet that you used to go to the coffee shop, to drive to work, that still traces back to organizations that are involved in global supply chains, regulation, labor standards, and more. The truth is, organizations are all around us, and they impact every facet of our daily life. They're the air we breathe, literally. Consider how many organizations influence the quality of the air you're breathing right now as you listen to this podcast. So, as I hope we've established at this point, although a lot of people think that organizations are strictly limited to civil service groups and nonprofits, the reality is they're private industry, they're nonprofits, and they're government institutions. Any place where a group of people are working together to accomplish a shared purpose. So as we wrap up this section, defining organizations, let's put some numbers around those definitions. Recently, the US Census reported there were over 8 million employer businesses in the US. The National Center for Charitable Statistics reported there were roughly 1.8 million nonprofits in the country. And at the federal level, there are over 400 agencies. And that's not counting the thousands more at the state and the local level that are having an impact on your life every day in ways that you see, but oftentimes it's in many more ways that you do not see. And so when we consider the enormous impact that organizations have on our lives, we have to consider the ways in which they work. And if they're working effectively, it's very likely that is accomplished through the successful implementation of organizational development principles and practices. I believe there are two fundamental truths that we can all agree on. People are complex and work is hard. At our best, when people work together for the shared purpose that we've talked about, the results can be amazing. They can advance our understanding of the world and they can improve our lives. But the factors that drive us to join organizations, our emotions, our motivations, and our personal ideals, also oftentimes lead to conflict in the organization due to our strong opinions about how an organization should achieve the shared goals that we've established. Think about the last time you were on a team that couldn't agree on priorities, or where the systems made the job harder, not easier, or where, quote unquote, the way things are done seemed to undercut the very goals you were trying to reach. That's all too common because when organizations form, it's really easy to unite around a compelling vision of how we're going to impact the world. But the challenge for new organizations or even established ones is figuring out how to accomplish that vision collectively and creating and maintaining those necessary structures, the processes, and procedures is incredibly difficult. And it's easy to become frustrated or overwhelmed by the complexity of that. But it's not hopeless because that's where the field of organizational development can help. Organizational development, simply put, is defined as the work of helping people, processes, and systems align more effectively. But more broadly, it's about asking a simple question: how do we work better together? And I think that's where the commonality comes in, whether you're a professional in the field or just someone trying to get your job done more productively. It starts with that simple curiosity of saying, why are we doing it this way? Could it be better? And then it tries to follow through with the tools and the strategies to make it happen. And that matters because every organizational problem we want to solve, whether it's burnout of staff, inefficiency of processes, stagnation, or disengagement, lives within a system. And you can't fix the problem without first understanding the system. But the great news is that organizational development helps you do both. At this point, organizational development might sound a bit abstract, but it's grounded in real life work. And I think to help establish that, I want to share an example from my own career. A few years ago, I was tasked with leading a major consolidation effort inside a state agency. We brought together staff and services from 5 different departments into one newly created office. These weren't just 5 org charts merging, these were 5 cultures. That meant that they brought their own ideas and histories of how they did work, how they engaged each other, and ultimately how they defined success. Even under the best of circumstances, bringing people together to form a new organization is incredibly challenging. But these were staff that were very happy in the departments that they were previously in. And even though this consolidation was mandated by a legislative bill, the staff assigned the blame and responsibility for the consolidation to the agency executive staff. Essentially, it was more like a forced marriage, complete with all the tension and uncertainty that you might expect. Understandably, morale was low, people were angry, worried about their roles, skeptical of leadership, and honestly exhausted by what they saw as continued forced change from people that, in their eyes, didn't understand their work or their value. Most of all, though, they felt like this was being done to them as opposed to being done with them. And to a certain extent, they weren't wrong. And so when I was asked to come in and rebuild or build this new organizational culture, we didn't just move names on spreadsheets by working with human resources, budget, and other administrative functions, and then hoping for the best. We used organizational development strategies, specifically around change management, to establish a shared culture. We built in listening sessions. We created new shared processes instead of forcing old ones. We continuously upgraded the onboarding process to make sure people were productive and felt a part of the culture that we were building. And we introduced the concept of data to track key metrics to show that they weren't to be used punitively, but to help identify where resource allocation mattered most and how we could use data to tell narrative stories that actually helped staff rather than hurt them. But one of the most important tools that we leaned on was the introduction of an annual staff survey. Simple enough in theory, but over time it became a cornerstone of our strategy. We used the data to track how people were feeling, to identify pain points, and adjust course in real time. And the impact was measurable. One stat that really sticks out to me is that we would ask every year how staff felt about the long term career opportunities that they saw in their department. And over the course of several years, we saw the agreement that there was good long term opportunities go from 41% to 70%. Now, to me, that's not just a statistic, that's showing that we listened and we acted upon feedback and that we built trust to create retention and cultural buy in the organization. Now, 70% might not sound like a lot, but I think there's some context that matters here. In 2023, a Gartner study found that only 46% of US employees felt supported in growing their careers. And in 2024, a Pew report found that only 26% were very satisfied with their promotion opportunities. So I think that 70% in a newly merged division after heavy initial resistance was a big win. Now, I'm not telling that story to pat myself on the back or the backs of the team members that I was working with at the time overseeing this cultural transformation. I'm telling this story to show that organizational development can move from the abstract to the real and that it is replicable for organizations to achieve that level of success if they commit themselves to the resources needed and the dedication associated with implementation of organizational development principles. This isn't magic that we're talking about. We're not waving a wand to achieve this. It's methodology that's tried and true, that's used over time, that leads to organizations functioning more effectively. So, as we move from talking about organizational development as an abstract and into a more grounded reality, I think the appropriate conclusion to today's episode is to briefly talk about and identify the six core functions as I see them as a part of the field. Think of these as the pillars that we'll continue to return to as we're talking about organizational development and how they collectively work together to create more effective organizations. The first one is strategic planning, which is about defining a clear vision for the future and outlining the concrete actions needed within a specific time frame to achieve it. And this includes vision and mission definition, goal setting, resource allocation, and action plan creation. But most importantly to me, it is about a documented level of accountability to ourselves and our stakeholders that helps us keep on track with what the ambitious goals are that we have for the organization. The second is process improvement, which is about continuously evaluating our processes and implementing methods to enhance their efficiency, to reduce completion time, increase staff satisfaction, and conserve resources. Typically, those activities would include process mapping, root cause analysis, and benchmarking. The third is stakeholder engagement, which is about proactively communicating with both internal staff and external customers and partners to understand their needs, to define their communication styles, and then using that information to guide actions of the organization. Usual activities would include stakeholder identification, communication assessments, regular updates, reporting, and conflict resolution, which means we're halfway through the six. So the fourth is training and professional development, essentially equipping staff with industry best practices, enhancing subject matter expertise, and fostering essential soft skills and compliance knowledge. And this includes new employee orientation, regular workshops, cross training of staff in different departments and different subject matter expertises, and making sure that you have mentorship programs. And then the fifth is change management, which we talked a little bit about already in the real world example that I provided earlier in the podcast episode. And this is about supporting employees through those periods of transformation and helping to minimize resistance to ensure successful adaptation to the change that the organization and the staff are going through. And those key activities include things like communication planning and delivery, resistance management, impact assessments, and ongoing engagement with staff. Finally, for me, is performance measurement. Now, performance measurement is something that sometimes you might see lumped in as a product and piece of the other five. But for me, it sits on its own because performance measurement, data analytics, data driven decision making is already very important, only becoming more important in how organizations function, that I like to identify it as its own discipline as a part of the core functions. And this is about collecting and analyzing data to assess how well the organization is meeting its internal goals and industry standards. And this usually involves things like setting up key performance metrics, the process of data collection, ongoing monitoring of that data across the organization, and then ultimately using it to evaluate the current success and where you need to go next. And so those are the six pillars that I've identified that we'll use in this podcast moving forward. They are all equally important. They support each other. And when they're done well, they create a resilient and an adaptive organization that's prepared for anything. They help the organization be more than reactive. They help it evolve in meeting its shared purpose. I think it's important in understanding why I started this podcast to understand that we need the work of organizational development now more than ever. The world is changing fast, technologically, politically, culturally, And organizations that don't change with it often lose their relevance and fail financially, but more importantly, at the mission that they were trying to accomplish to begin with. And so, for the benefit of everyone associated with that organization, the staff, the stakeholders, and most importantly, the people that are relying upon the goods or services being provided, organizations need to continue to implement organizational development to ensure that they can succeed in a hyper competitive world. As I mentioned earlier, this is not magic that we're talking about. These are skills that are learnable and they're doable. They're not reserved for big companies or consultants with lots of money or decades of experience. It can be done by anyone and everyone. And that's what this podcast is here to support. So, whether you're a professional in the field of organizational development, or again, someone who is just trying to make your work and your colleagues' work more productive, I hope that you continue to find this podcast a meaningful part of your week so that you can make that a reality. Finally, today, as I mentioned in episode 0, at the end of each episode, I'll leave you with something to reflect on and something to try in a segment I call the step forward. So here are 3 questions for you to reflect on based on today's topic. 1, what challenges is your organization currently facing? And how urgent are they to solve? 2, of the 6 OD core functions that we talked about today, which of those does your organization do well? And which of those do you think needs work? And finally, do you think your organization is resistant to change or supportive of it? And for your action challenge, I'd like you to identify one process that feels confusing or inefficient. And then I want you to bring it up respectfully in a meeting or with a colleague that worked on that process. Ask about it, work through a suggested improvement, and then reflect on what happened as a result of that interaction. As always, that sound means we've reached the end of today's episode of the Strategic Advance podcast. I hope this helped you think differently about your organization, and if it did, consider subscribing and sharing it with a colleague. You can find more insights and resources on Substack at The Strategic Advance and connect with me on Blue Sky at Adam Poser. And if you have feedback, ideas, or just want to say hi, email me, leave a comment, or engage in whatever way that you find most convenient. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for being here, and I'll catch you next time on The Strategic Advance.